So now how do we actually get revenue tied to the projects? Well, for those specific use cases, we're going to be leveraging invoices in NetSuite. And similar to before, we have all these transactions broken out by the same data model, the same architecture that you saw on the sales order and throughout the reports, right? So you see that cohesion between our data model and throughout the entire system, whether it's the granular level of transactions or the reporting functions that we have. Everything is cohesive and is built on the data model and data architecture of work codes and cost types, which is what we've seen in, construction legacy systems, and is what is the expected data model when customers are transitioning from a construction ERP legacy system to something like a NetSuite. So you can see for this specific invoice, I have these lines broken up by work code and cost type, right? One other piece of our construction bundle is the ability to do retainage. Johnny mentioned earlier that we can do retainage both for the AR and the AP side. And depending on which micro vertical you're sort of working in, whether that's GCs, they'll have more AP style retainage because they're going to be working with dozens, if not hundreds of different subcontractors. And retainage is a major point in their contracts with their subs. And so if you're familiar with retainage, that's just going to be the retention of a specific amount or specific percentage of the overall contract that you have with your subs. And you're going to hold on to that amount until they've until they've completed ultimately their scope of work for that specific phase of the project, right? And then you'll release those funds or pay those subcontractors once they've completed their scope of work. What we're seeing here is more on the AR side, and so you're withholding a specific retained amount. Again, you'll then be paid once you've fulfilled your specific requirements that you've agreed to upfront with your customer or with your client here. But again, we can see we have an invoice for just over $24,000. Again, that's going to automatically map to your project record. So you can see it at a high level, but then you can also see it at the granular level that we saw before, right? And it's the same sort of scenarios as we go through, the procure-to-pay process. So when you're cutting out POs, when you're generating vendor bills, ultimately it's going to be the same data model, same architecture that we've seen throughout the platform. And it's that consistency that matters, right? We don't want to create dysfunction within the system where, the order to cash process isn't necessarily talking to the procure to pay process. We want to make sure that it's the same data model throughout all the different transactions in NetSuite. So what we can see here is we have a purchase order. It looks like for some subcontracting work. And again, it's tied to a work code. It's tied to the cost type. And again, it's going to vary customer to customer depending on what level they ultimately want to report on. But what you can see is we're tracking the cost amount, and that's ultimately going to be pulling in to our specific projects, right? So we have a committed cost of just over $29,000, which is being mapped through all the different purchase orders that we have in the system. And what's great about NetSuite and Appficiency is there's checks and balances in place so you can always sort of audit your own work. So if you think about sort of the day-to-day users that are going to be using the system, you imagine someone entering a transaction like a purchase order, like an invoice, like a sales order, what you're going to be able to see is the ability to sort of audit yourself and ensure that it's being tagged appropriately to the projects that you ultimately tagged it to. And so part of these checks and balances is enabling these users to run these safe searches to ultimately check, hey, did I actually post that purchase order to the correct project, right? And we can see here that check and balance, and we can see all the different purchase orders that ultimately are being tagged and committed to my specific project. Okay. And then sort of to end the process of the procure-to-pay workflow, we have the vendor bills, right? So these vendor bills are going to be your actual costs, and these actual costs are going to map to what we call our actual cost job costing metrics. And this is ultimately what's going to feed and calculate your percent cost complete. Now, percent cost complete is usually actual costs, 99% of the time, actual costs over total budgeted costs. But those actual costs can vary depending on which customer you speak to. Do they want to track inventory costs? Do they want to track direct labor costs, indirect labor costs, overhead costs? Right. So the equation or the formula for each company can change, but ultimately where we can pull data from in NetSuite can be from a number of different records. For the job costing standard SKU, what we found is, especially for GCs and in most subs, is vendor bills is where they want to pull their actual costs from. But again, there's flexibility and there's conversations that can be had to ultimately figure out what parts of the solution work best for them. But we can see for this vendor bill, we're withholding retainage of 10%. And so we saw retainage on the AR side, but we can see we also can help manage retainage on the AP side, whether it's just retainage line to line or retainage at a high level where you just want to take a flat 10% across all of your vendor bill. Ultimately, we can track that and treat that retainage separately than how you would treat your normal receivables or your normal payables. Okay, and so we see the vendor bill ultimately being tied back to our project at JC7, and this is ultimately going to calculate your percent cost complete.